Bava Batra, Daf Yomi hostages, pedion, שבויים, מצוה rabahi. There's so many beautiful pieces of Gemara to talk about on Daf Ches, and yet with pedion, שבויים coming up, the mitzvah of redeeming hostages, I couldn't focus on anything else but that one for today. Because we spoke yesterday about the importance of being able to hear and see the ani. It's not just a transaction. It's not just there's a poor person in the community needs some help, give him some money, and he goes on his way. There's a requirement, as we learned yesterday, to hear lishmoa et kolo, to hear his voice. And that if one creates barriers to the ani's capacity to communicate directly with you, if we institutionalize tzedakah in a way where the ani, the poor person, gets what he needs financially, but he doesn't have an opportunity to engage with the balabayit, with the wealthy person. That's not what it's about. That the Torah doesn't want us to structure our community life in a way that sterilizes us from the anguish and the pain of other people. It's part of life to be able to empathize, to be able to be part of that, to be able to look at the ani and daven for him, as we learned the power of tefillah, the marshor that we brought yesterday from Kiddushin. Tefillah helps naturally, it's not even miraculously, but the tefillah has to come from deep within one in order for it to work naturally. And tefillah comes from deep within one when one is moved deeply inside oneself. And you move deeply when you empathize with the suffering of another person, then you can really say, you can give the person bracha. I've mentioned to you the beautiful story, I think it's Adin Steinsaltz talks about the time when the Lubavitcher Rebbe was offered a letter opener, an electric letter opener, because he was opening so many letters every day, it was hard, taking a lot of his time. And he refused it. He said, when I hold that envelope in my hand and I tear it open, it's in those moments that I feel the tears of the person writing. And then I can read the letter, and then I can give an answer or give a bracha. And you want to institutionalize the letter opening. And this is a problem with our life today. We're institutionalizing and digitalizing and creating technologies to distance us from one another. It doesn't create closeness. It's true, you look at things like Zoom and email and texting, it creates enormous opportunity for communication, but it doesn't create intimacy, it doesn't create closeness. On the contrary, technology is a barrier between us and the other. It's like the Beit Shar that we talked about yesterday, that's a barrier between the ani. It doesn't allow you to hear with your heart. It only allows you to gain information and to react to the information. But if you reacted to the heart, with your heart, to the heart, you would give the ani much more. Either more money, or even more important, you would give him more than money, if you were able to do so. But there is an ani, and the word ani doesn't just mean a person who's poor, in monetary terms. Unkelus always translates ani in the Torah as miskin, as somebody who's unfortunate, somebody who's lacking. There is an ani who you can't see. There is an ani who you can't hear. There is an ani who can't knock on your door, who can't go around the streets crying. And that's the shavui. That's the hostage. That has that need and that deficiency. And the biggest risk of all is that he becomes out of mind. When the ani cries outside your door, he can't be out of mind. And so we're constantly drawn back to the reality of human suffering. That's built into our community life, that we should never sterilize ourselves from human suffering. A person who's been taken hostage, a person who's been taken captive, runs the risk of being forgotten. And even if not forgotten, again, from an information perspective, we all have the information. We know how many hostages are. Many of us know their names. We daven for them. But we don't hear them. And we don't see them. And that's why their families have been so meticulous about keeping pictures up all over and having opportunities to engage, so that there's some kind of visual impact more than just information. And pedion שבויים, taking care of the שבויים, is such an important mitzvah. We have at the bottom of Daf Yomi Bava Batra, Ifra Hormiz Ime de Shvor Malka. This is the same Shvor Malka that we had at the end of Bava Metzia. The king of this Persian king, his mother was Ifra Hormiz, Shadra Arnaka de Dinari Lekami de Rav Yosef. She sent a pile of money to Rav Yosef. Amra Lehevi le mitzvah rabba. Use this money for a mitzvah rabba, for a really important mitzvah. Yativ Rav Yosef, My mitzvah rabba. Rav Yosef felt obligated to define what a very great mitzvah is, so that he uses the money for the right things. If you learn what Abaye said in the name of Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, you don't impose the obligation of giving charity to the community coffers on orphans for various reasons, even for pidyon shvuim. That word even for redeeming hostages, shma mina, from that we learn that pidyon shvuim mitzvah rabohi, that the pidyon shvuim is the biggest mitzvah that there can be. Even for that, you don't impose a tax on the orphans. Where do we get it from? That pidyon shvuim is a mitzvah rabbi, is such a great mitzvah? He answers, Rabbi Bar Miri answers Rava with a posuk from Yirmiyahu, and I bring the posuk and the previous posuk at the beginning of the source sheet. This is a very sad and difficult parak in Yirmiyahu, where Yirmiyahu says to the people before the Churban Beis Hamikdash, "Vayomer Hashem Elayim Yamod Moshe u'Shmuel lefanai, ein nafshi el ha'am hazeh." You're so far gone as a nation. You've disappointed me so far that even if Moshe and Shmuel were standing before me, says Hashem, begging for you, I would send them away. There's nothing that will change my mind. Shalach me'al panai vayitzeu. Go away from me and go. Get out of here. And if the people will say, where are we meant to go? You will say to them, where are you going to go? Some will go to death. Some will go to the sword. And some will go to hunger. And some will become hostages. That's what's in it. You've so disappointed me. The nation has gone so far. That's what lies ahead. Imagine if we knew that this is what the Rebbeinu Shem was saying last Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Just these words. This is the posuk that Rebbeinu Shem Chas v'Shalom was probably saying last Yom Kippur. And how we've got to make sure that this Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's a different story. So based on that posuk, the Gemara says, each later thing in this verse is harder than the earlier one. Sword is worse than death. I can bring you a verse to prove that, or it's logical. It's logical. If a person dies naturally, at least his body is not mutilated with a sword. His body is mutilated. And we've got a posuk, Hashem values natural death for his chasidim, that they shouldn't chas v'sholem be killed violently. Rav kashem micherev, hunger is worse than the sword. You can say it logically, at least with the sword it's instant. With hunger it's slow and it's terrible, there's suffering. Or you've got a posuk, Shvi, what about captivity? Becoming a hostage, kashem mikulam. That's the worst of all, worse than death, worse than the sword, worse than hunger. To kulu itnu. Because in the situation of a hostage, all of these terrible things are included. And a Gemara like this just helps us connect with what's going on. It's so easy, again, it's a piece of information and we put it in the back of our heads and occasionally we think about it, we see a picture, we hear something and it reminds us about what's going on and then we carry on with our cup of coffee. And a piece of Gemara like this just causes us to pause and to think and to feel. What does it mean these things are all within him? Says Rashi, Shehu biyad ha'akum la'asot bo kol chefzo im la'mavet im la'charev im la'rav. Ask Rashi, you don't know that the hostage is suffering death. You don't know whether he's alive or not. Hopefully he's alive. You don't know he's going to be killed by sword. You don't know he's suffering hunger. You don't know what's happening. What does it mean that a hostage is suffering all of these terrible things? In what way, says Rashi? Because he's in the hands of akum, of terrorists, who have the capacity to do all these things to him. And there's an interesting Ma'ashor, where the Ma'ashor says he doesn't have the capacity to cause natural death, he has the capacity to kill him with a sword. But the Ma'ashor says, but he's in a human being, a delicate human being who comes from a civilized city, finds himself in the hardship of a strange country, in a strange environment, it's possible he's not going to survive. It might cause his death. So it's interesting, we see in Rashi here, the fact that you're living with the constant fear of any of these things being applied to you. Your captor can kill you, your captor can starve you. All of these things can cause you to die slowly. The fact that they can do that means you're suffering that suffering all the time. And the hostages that have come out, how many of them have said to us that the worst was the fear? Every time they heard the footsteps, every time there was a knock on the door, and the door opened, every time they thought they were coming to kill them. It's living in the state of fear. That's not a life. So we've got to try and understand what that's like, to live in a state where at any moment another human being who has no moral conscience has such power over you, power over life and death he's got. And you're living with that every moment. That's what it is to be a hostage. And that's the fear, and that's why we've got to take this person out, we've got to save this person. It says the Rambam Paskas in Hilchos Matnos Aniyim, Pedion Shvuim Kodem Leparnasat Aniyim Ulechasutam, saving Shvuim with money if necessary, comes before any other call on charity. And there's nothing so serious and important as redeeming Shvuim. Because a person who's in shevi, a person who's a captive, a hostage, he is a ra'ev, he is a tzameh, he's hungry, he's thirsty, he's naked, he's in sakonas nefoshes, he's in danger of death. And anybody who doesn't focus on saving him, there are all sorts of averot one's doing. Lo tametzet levavcha, lo tikpotz et yadcha, lo tamod al dam re'echa, lo yirdena befarech le'enecha, uvatel mitzvat patoch tiftach et yadolo. You're not keeping the mitzvah of opening your hand to save him. Umitzvat v'chai achicha imach. You're not being mekayim the mitzvah. You're not observing the mitzvah to ensure that other people can live. Loving your neighbor as yourself. It's a pasuk in Mishle, saving people who've been captured from death. And many others. There's so many terrible averot wrapped up in allowing a hostage to stay where he is. And there's no mitzvah as great as Pedion Shvuim. In Halacha Yud Beis, the Rambam brings from Gittin that there are certain riders, there are certain provisos on this. There are times you don't pay more than the person is worth, so to say, in order that otherwise it'll become an everyday thing. That was the case with the Maram Rutenberg. If you give them whatever they ask, there'll be a constant taking of Jewish people in order to gain ransom. So the Beis Din has to think very carefully about situations where you don't do it, because that's in the interests of the Jewish community ultimately. Then mavrichim et hashvuim, is be careful not to free them, not to go in and get them out sometimes, because that will make them treat the others worse. So there are all these serious shikulim, all these things you've got to think about when you're making these decisions. Yes, we can go and save 3 shvuyim, and that's a wonderful thing because it's pidyon shvuyim. But what if that endangers the remaining shvuyim even more? These are situations one needs the Urim V'Tumim for. These are the things one needs Das Torah for. This is not even something you can work out rationally. You need people who are connected to Hashem, to the Torah, to be able to give guidance as to what to do under these circumstances. It's far too complex for any human being just to make a rational decision. But it goes a step further. We understand this, and I've struggled with the Gemara a little bit. So we're saying Shevi is worse than death. But when a person's alive, there's hope. And when a person's dead, there isn't. And you see with the families of the Shvuyim, there were some people who said, I hope they die early so that they don't go through the suffering if they're going to die in any case. But there's always the hope, always the families hope that the person's alive, believe that the person's alive, that the person will come back. There's always hope when the person's alive. How can you say that Shev is worse than death? And even worse than a terrible death, At least as long as the person's alive, there's hope. Hope he will be released, hope something will happen. And that hope goes with death. What does the Gemara mean when it says that in the case of Shevi kashemi kulam de kulu itnu be? And Rashi says because potentially he could be killed in that way. Understand that, but potentially he could also be saved. Whereas once he's dead, he doesn't have that potential. What does the Gemara really mean? And here there's a very important principle that we need to understand. It's not an easy principle, and that is Jews don't live by hope. I know our national anthem is Hatikva, but that wasn't written by Talmidei Chachomim. We don't have tikva. The idea of tikva is not a Jewish concept. We have emunah. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema. That's what the Jews sang going to the gas chambers. Not Hatikva. They sang Hatikva as well in certain situations, but going to the gas, it's Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema. That a Jew never loses his emunah. And notice that emunah doesn't mean, it's not Ani ma'amin sheyavo hamashiach. It's not I believe that. Ani ma'amin beviyat hamashiach. It's a belief in. And belief in is the highest form of knowledge that there can be. If I know something, I know it based on certain information and facts. But there's always the possibility that I don't have all the facts. So no matter how clear my knowledge is, it's always limited, because I don't know what facts I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. I only know what I do know. Emunah is a deeper intuitive sense of knowledge. With emunah, I believe in something. Nothing can shake a belief in. It's like the difference even believing in another person. I believe in my child. I believe in my parent. I believe in a person. Believe in is something very empowering. It's not just knowing, I know that you can do this. How do you know I can do that? What information have you got? I believe in you. I believe you can do it. That's different. And we operate with emunah. To have emunah, to have belief in something, you need to be connected to Hashem. It's an neshamadika thing, it's a spiritual thing, it's a soul thing, belief. Knowledge is a mental thing, a cerebral thing. Belief is a spiritual thing. It comes from deep inside the neshama, and the neshama has to be alive. The Chassam Sofer, through asking some lomdisha questions, reaches a very innovative conclusion, which gives us an even deeper understanding into the suffering of the hostages. And he says, he says, there's some questions on this. Firstly, in Gemara, in Megillah Yudalad, the Gemara says, why do we read the Megillah? How did the Chachomim add the mitzvah of Megillah? If we don't have Megillah in the Torah, it said they made a kal vachomer. Since me'avdut l'cheirut omrim shira, we say shira, coming from slavery to freedom. Mimita l'chaim l'kol shchen, if our lives were saved, not more so. So you see that life is worth more than freedom. And also Yehuda, when Yehuda saves Yosef, ma betzaki narog. Why should we kill Yosef? He says, let's sell him into slavery. Let's make him a hostage. Asks the Chassam Sofer, but hostage is worse than death. Let him die rather. So you see that hostage isn't worse than death. A very powerful kasha on the Gemara. Asks the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer is mechadish that hostage is worse than death for Jews. For a Gentile, not so. Because a Gentile can adapt. It's a terrible thing being a hostage. It's a terrible thing for anybody. But worse than death? No. Because he can adapt. He'll live. He'll change his life. As the Gemara says, he brings from the Gemara, it's all very well. A non-Jew who can eat their bread, eat their food, live their life. Exile is not as serious as it is for a Jew who can never adapt to that existence, because he can't eat their food. He's got to keep Shabbos, so he can never become one of them. So he remains isolated in his captivity, and that's what's worse than death. And to understand that, and then he explains very beautifully the case of Yehuda and the case of coming out of Mitzrayim, why those cases are different. And what we understand over here is when a Jew can't keep his Torah or mitzvahs, the problem is at a spiritual level. If you look at it at a physical and an emotional level, captivity is not worse than death. Captivity is terrible, but it's not worse than death. Death is the worst. It's the end of all hope. But for a Jew who lives by his neshama, to live in a situation where you can't keep Torah and mitzvot, that's not life. And it's not about hope, it's about, can you have emunah, can you live with emunah? You can't live with emunah if you're not connected. And it's interesting, Chassam Sofer doesn't make the difference between religious Jews and non-religious Jews. He says, Dafka Yisrael Shomrei Torah, as opposed to Umot HaOlam. It's a Jew who keeps the Torah, meaning every Jew, almost every Jew, keeps something of Torah. And we know also from the hostage situation how much they suffered on Yom Tov, on Pesach. Jews that don't keep anything else, but they keep a kind of a Seder. And we know what that suffering was like on Pesach. On Friday night, where many of them would have a Seudah at home, even if they weren't Shomrei Shabbos, but they would have something, and they can't have that there. When a Jew is divorced from his spirituality, from his Shmirat Torah Mitzvot, from his observance of Torah Mitzvahs, it's very hard for him to access that emunah, that belief in. He can believe that. He can hope. But to believe in, you need to be able to access your spiritual connection to the divine, to be able to believe in the future, not just to know the future, but to believe in the future. You need to be connected to the divine. And if a Jew suffers death, yes, he's no longer connected to the divine at a physical level, but his life is over and his life was complete. But if he's living a life where he can't keep Torah or mitzvot because somebody else controls his freedom, and he doesn't have the capacity to do that, and he's all the time in danger and at risk. He's at physical risk and he's at spiritual loss. There he can't even have the emunah that gives him the hope, the emunah that gives him a vision of the future, an opportunity for the future, and that's why it would be worse even than death. And as I said, this piece of Gemara, it causes one to just pause and think and feel what's going on at a deeper level for these individuals. Even if it was one person, one would have to stop and think and feel. Certainly that it's over 100 people still that are in this situation of terrible suffering. And to understand that, again, the questions of what do we do about it, how much do we sacrifice to get the hostages out, these are questions for the Gedolei Yisrael. These are very, very difficult questions. But one thing is for sure, each single one of us can hear, can listen, can see, although they're not physically in front of us. We need to have the image of their suffering. Don't sterilize yourself, don't insulate yourself from their suffering, chas v'sholom, but allow yourself to feel that and to let that suffering ignite tefillah. Let your empathy for them, if you feel it deeply enough, ignite a tefillah that comes from deep within you. Not just to babble a thing at Kriyas Torah time and after Tehillim every morning. That's good. It's wonderful that the whole community is doing that all over the world. But that's not what's going to change them. What's going to change them is each one of us turning to Hashem in a tefillah that comes from deep, deep, deep in our neshamot, that has been triggered by a terrible pain that we feel about how they are suffering. May Hashem bring them back soon.